At 11:23, on the morning of March 4, 1944, Colonel Don Blakeslee checked his fuel gauge and looked down through the canopy of his P-51 Mustang at a sight no American fighter pilot had ever seen from this altitude, Berlin. The German capital sprawled beneath him, gray and industrial, stretching to the horizon under a thin layer of haze. Blakeslee had been fighting this war for 3 years. He had flown Spitfires with the Royal Air Force Eagle squadrons when America was still neutral. He had watched friends die over the English Channel, over France, over the Low Countries, and now he was here, 600 miles from his base in England, escorting American heavy bombers to the heart of the Third Reich. His guns had jammed somewhere over Hanover. It did not matter. He stayed with the formation anyway, because that was the kind of leader he was. His pilots needed to see his aircraft out front. They needed to know that if they could make it to Berlin, so could he. What Blakeslee did not know, what none of the American pilots knew, was that somewhere below them, German commanders were watching, and the sight of those long-nosed American fighters circling lazily over the capital city told them something that all the intelligence reports and production statistics had failed to convey. The war was lost. Hermann Göring, Reichsmarshal of the German Luftwaffe, would later tell his interrogators that when fighters appeared over Berlin, he knew the eventual results would be tragic. Different sources recorded his reflections slightly differently over the years. Some quoted him as saying he knew the jig was up. Others recalled him stating that the war was lost. The exact words varied, but the meaning was always the same. The most powerful Air Force commander in Nazi Germany had watched American fighters over his capital city and understood what was coming. This is the story of how a single aircraft born from British desperation and American engineering evolved from a disappointment into the weapon that broke the Luftwaffe. It is the story of the men who flew it, the men who built it, and the men who died because it arrived too late to save them. It is the story of how one airplane changed the course of history. To understand why Mustangs over Berlin mattered, you have to understand what came before. You have to understand black. Thursday, October 14th, 1943, 291 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses lifted off from bases across eastern England and turned toward Germany. Their target was Schweinfurt, a small Bavarian city that produced nearly half of all the ball bearings used by German industry. Ball bearings were everywhere. Tank turrets, aircraft engines, submarine propellers. Destroy the ball bearing factories, American planners believed, and you would cripple the German war machine. The bombers flew in tight formations, gunners manning .50 caliber machine guns in every direction. Doctrine said they could protect themselves. Doctrine said massed defensive firepower would drive off any attacker. Doctrine was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. The problem was range. American fighter escorts, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, so far before their fuel ran low, they could accompany the bombers part way into Germany. Then they had to turn back. The bombers continued. Alone, the Luftwaffe knew this. They knew exactly how far American fighters could reach. They waited just beyond that invisible line on the map. When the Thunderbolts turned for home, somewhere over the German border, the killing began. German fighters struck the bomber formations in waves. Messerschmitt, Bf-109s, and Focke-Wulf FW-190s attacked from every angle. Some came head-on cannon shells, smashing through cockpit glass, killing pilots in their seats. Others slid in from the side, firing rockets into the tightly packed formations. Explosions ripped bombers apart. Aircraft tumbled out of formation, trailing fire and smoke. Crews bailed out into the frozen sky or died where they sat. The bomber crews fought back with everything they had. Their gunners claimed 186 German fighters destroyed that day, a number wildly exaggerated. Actual German losses were between 35 and 38. Aircraft in exchange, the Luftwaffe shot down 60 American bombers. Another 17 were so badly damaged they were scrapped. 121 more returned with battle damage. 600 American airmen were killed, wounded, or captured in a single afternoon. The loss rate exceeded 20%. At that rate, no bomber crew could expect to survive a full tour of duty. Crews were required to fly 25 missions. The mathematics of attrition were unforgiving. Send a man up 25 times with a 20% chance of loss on each mission, and his odds of coming home were essentially zero. The human cost extended far beyond the men who died. Every bomber that went down carried 10 crewmen. Each had families waiting at home, parents, wives, sweethearts who would soon receive telegrams beginning with the words, "The Secretary of War desires to express his deepest regret." Some families would learn months later that their sons or husbands were alive, prisoners of war. Many would never know exactly what happened. For the crews who survived and returned to their bases in England, the psychological toll was immense. They had watched friends die in burning aircraft. They had seen parachutes that failed to open men, tumbling through 30,000 feet of empty sky. They had felt their own aircraft shudder under cannon fire, smelled burning hydraulic fluid, and felt the freezing wind blasting through holes torn in the fuselage. And they knew that tomorrow, or the day after, they would have to do it all again. The 8th Air Force had been shattered. Deep penetration raids into Germany without fighter escort were suspended immediately. The bombers would not return to Schweinfurt for 4 months. The suspension was never officially described as a defeat, but it amounted to the same thing. American strategic doctrine had called for daylight, precision bombing of key industrial targets. That doctrine required penetrating deep into enemy territory without continuous fighter escort. Such penetrations were suicide. The British had confronted the same reality earlier in the war and reached a different conclusion. After suffering devastating losses in daylight raids in 1939 and 1940, RAF Bomber Command abandoned daylight operations and shifted to night bombing. Under cover of darkness, British bombers could reach German cities without facing massed Luftwaffe fighter attacks. The price of night bombing was accuracy. Unable to see their targets clearly, British crews struck area targets entire cities, rather than specific factories. This approach was morally controversial and strategically uncertain, but it was survivable. RAF crews had a reasonable chance of completing their tours. The Americans rejected this solution. They believed their heavy bombers, equipped with the Norden bombsight and protected by massed defensive firepower, could operate effectively in daylight. They believed precision attacks against specific targets would be more decisive than area bombing. They believed quite simply that they could succeed where the British had failed. Black Thursday shattered those beliefs. The Norden bombsight was, in fact, accurate. But accuracy meant nothing if the bombers were shot down before they reached their targets. Massed defensive firepower was formidable, but not formidable enough to stop determined German interceptors. Everything the Americans believed about their ability to operate without fighter escort was wrong. General Henry Hop Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces, publicly described the loss of 60 bombers as incidental. Reality told a different story. Unescorted daylight raids deep into Germany were suspended until further notice. Entire strategic bombing campaign, cornerstone of Allied strategy for defeating Nazi Germany, was on the verge of collapse. The bomber generals had promised that daylight precision bombing could win the war. Now, those promises looked like fantasies. Without long-range fighter escort, the bombers could not survive, and no such fighter existed. Or so everyone believed. The cost of those beliefs could be measured in empty beds and unfinished letters home. In every bomber group across England, the mathematics of survival became a constant, unspoken presence. A man might lie awake in his barracks at night and count the faces around him, knowing that many of them would not be there by Christmas. The odds were that stark, that inescapable. The problem was not courage. American bomber crews had courage in abundance. They climbed into their aircraft day after day, knowing the odds were against them. knowing that statistical reality offered no meaningful chance of completing a full tour, and they went anyway. The problem was the fundamental limitation of the aircraft. They flew and the doctrine that governed how they were used. The B-17 Flying Fortress was a marvel of engineering. It could fly higher than most contemporary fighters, carry thousands of pounds of bombs, hundreds of miles, absorb tremendous damage, and still bring its crew home. Its .50 caliber machine guns covered every angle of approach, but it could not outrun the enemy. It could not fight its way to Berlin alone, and it could not change the laws of attrition. Formation of B-17s, properly flown, was indeed a formidable defensive system, but not formidable enough. German pilots had developed tactics specifically designed to defeat the bomber formations. They attacked head-on, where the defensive firepower was weakest, and where a single cannon shell through the cockpit could kill the pilots instantly. They fired rockets from beyond machine gun range to break up the formations, then closed in to pick off the stragglers. They concentrated on wounded bombers that had fallen out of position, knowing that isolated aircraft were easy prey against these tactics. Bomber doctrine had no answer. The only real solution was to have friendly fighters present to drive the attackers away. But the fighters could not be present because no fighter had the range. It was a problem that seemed to have no solution. The airplane that would change everything had been sitting in hangars across England for 2 years, dismissed as a disappointment. The North American P-51 Mustang had been born in 1940, designed and built in just 102 days to meet an urgent British request. Britain needed fighters desperately, and American Curtiss P-40 production lines were already running at capacity. North American aviation offered to design something better and faster. The original Mustang was a beautiful aircraft, sleek, fast, with an innovative laminar flow wing that reduced drag and gave it exceptional range. But it had one critical flaw. Its Allison V1710 engine performed well at low altitude, but lost power above 15,000 feet. At the altitudes where the bombers flew on, where combat against the Luftwaffe was decided, the Mustang was simply to slow. The problem was the supercharger. The Allison engine used a single-stage supercharger, with a critical altitude of only about 11,800 feet. Above that height, the engine could no longer compress the thinning air sufficiently to maintain power. The airplane that looked so promising near the ground became lethargic and vulnerable at bomber altitude. As a result, the Mustang was written off as unsuitable for high-altitude combat in Europe, and so it sat fast, elegant and misunderstood while men kept dying over Germany. The Mustang would start strong in the climb, then gradually fall behind as altitude increased. By the time it reached 20,000 feet, the bombers cruised, and where German interceptors waited, it was gasping for breath. The Royal Air Force used its Mustangs for ground attack and tactical reconnaissance roles where high-altitude performance did not matter. The aircraft was regarded as a fine design, burdened by a disappointing engine. It seemed destined to remain a footnote in aviation history. Then, on April 30th, 1942, a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronald Harker visited the Air Fighting Development Unit at RAF Duxford and asked to fly one of the American fighters. He took the Mustang up for half an hour, putting it through its paces, and landed with an idea that would change the war. The airplane, Harker reported, was magnificent below 15,000 feet, fast maneuverable, with exceptional range. Its only weakness was altitude performance, and that weakness came from the engine. The Allison simply could not deliver power in thin air, but Rolls-Royce had an engine that could. The Merlin 6, with its two-stage two-speed supercharger, was the power plant that had made the Spitfire competitive at every altitude. What Harker asked would happen if you took the Mustang's superb airframe and replaced its Allison engine with a Merlin. Harker immediately telephoned Ray Dory, head of Rolls-Royce's experimental division, to advocate for the conversion. His superiors were intrigued. By June 1942, Rolls-Royce had begun fitting Merlin engines, 2 Mustang airframes, at their facility in Hucknall. The first converted aircraft designated Mustang X flew on October 13, 1942. The results were nothing short of spectacular. The Merlin-powered Mustang reached 433 miles per hour at 22,000 feet, more than 100 miles per hour faster than the Allison-powered version at the same altitude. Its rate of climb nearly doubled, and crucially, it retained the original Mustang's extraordinary range, a product of its efficient aerodynamics and large internal fuel tanks. For the first time, a fighter existed that could climb with the bombers, fight at altitude, and still fly all the way to Germany and back. The solution to the bomber crisis had been sitting in plain sight all along. The engineering explanation was straightforward. The Merlin engine used a 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger with an intercooler, allowing it to maintain power at high altitude where the air was thin. The Allison, by contrast, relied on a single-stage supercharger optimized for low-altitude performance at 15,000 feet. The 2 engines produced similar power. At 25,000 feet, the difference was decisive. The Merlin was still delivering near full-rated horsepower. The Allison was gasping, but the transformation involved more than simply swapping engines. The Merlin was heavier than the Allison and required a redesigned cowling to accommodate its larger supercharger system. The aircraft's center of gravity had to be adjusted by shifting the wing slightly forward. New intake designs were required for the intercooler. The propeller was changed from 3 blades to 4 to absorb the additional power. North American Aviation's engineers worked through these challenges with remarkable speed. The company that had designed the original Mustang in 102 days proved equally capable of redesigning it in months rather than years. The key was collaboration. British and American engineers shared information freely. Rolls-Royce provided detailed specifications for the Merlin. North American adapted its airframe to exploit the engine's full potential. At the center of this exchange was Major Thomas Hitchcock, the American assistant air attaché in London. Hitchcock served as a crucial liaison, ensuring that promising technical developments reached the right people on both sides of the Atlantic. He was an unusual figure for a wartime diplomatic post. Thomas Hitchcock had been a wealthy polo player and investment banker before the war. As a teenager in the First World War, he had flown combat missions, been shot down, escaped from a German prisoner of war camp, and walked more than 100 miles to Switzerland. He understood aviation technology because he understood combat, and he championed the Merlin Mustang with rare bureaucratic skill. Hitchcock predicted that the Merlin-powered Mustang would be the best fighter of 1943. He would not live to see the full proof of that claim. In April 1944, just weeks after the first Mustangs reached Berlin, Hitchcock was killed in a flying accident near Salisbury, England. He was testing P-51 dive characteristics, investigating the same high-speed instability that had already killed other pilots. Unable to pull out of a steep dive, he died in the aircraft he had done so much to bring into existence. He never saw the full impact of his work. For the first time in the war, the Allies now had a fighter that could fly all the way to Berlin, fight the Luftwaffe on equal terms, and fly all the way home. North American Aviation, meanwhile, had been thinking along similar lines. Working with Packard, licensed to build Merlin engines in Detroit, the company developed its own conversion. The first American Merlin-powered Mustang, designated the XP-51B, flew on November 30, 1942. The U.S. Army Air Forces were sufficiently impressed that they ordered 400 P-51Bs in August 1942. For a single Merlin Mustang had even flown. It was a gamble, but the need was desperate, and the preliminary calculations were compelling. Production began in earnest in 1943. The first P-51Bs arrived in England with the 354th Fighter Group in November. Originally assigned to the 9th Air Force for tactical operations, they were almost immediately pressed into service as bomber escorts by the 8th Air Force. The transformation of the American fighter force happened with remarkable speed. In December 1943, the 8th Air Force had only a handful of Mustangs. By March 1944, entire fighter groups were converting. By June, the P-51 equipped the majority of American escort squadrons in England. The logistics were staggering. Each Mustang required spare parts, ammunition, fuel, and trained ground crews. Pilots had to convert from whatever they had been flying before, learning the quirks of the new aircraft, its strengths, its weaknesses, and its rules for survival. Some pilots adapted faster than others, and those differences would matter, because the war over Germany was about to change forever. Don Blakeslee's 4th Fighter Group received its P-51Bs on February 25, 1944. When higher command expressed concern that the group was not yet ready, Blakeslee dismissed it. His pilots, he said, would learn to fly the Mustang on the way to the target. 3 days later, on February 28th, the group flew its first combat mission in the new aircraft. The change in tactics came from the very top. In January 1944, General Jimmy Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force. Doolittle was already famous for leading the first American bombing raid on Tokyo in 1942, but his most important contribution to the air war would be far less dramatic and far more decisive. The fighters Doolittle announced would no longer be tied to the bombers. Their mission was not merely to protect the formations, their mission was to destroy the Luftwaffe. It was a fundamental shift in doctrine. Under the old rules, escort fighters stayed close to the bombers, weaving above them in defensive patterns. They engaged German interceptors only when those interceptors directly threatened the formations. This defensive posture surrendered the initiative. German pilots chose when and where to attack. They assembled their formations unmolested. They struck the bombers at the moment of their choosing. Doolittle's new doctrine reversed everything. American fighters would now range ahead of the bomber streams, seeking out German interceptors before they could reach the bombers. They would strafe German airfields. They would attack aircraft on the ground. They would hunt the Luftwaffe wherever it could be found. The bomber crews were horrified. From their gun positions, it looked as though their protective umbrella was being stripped away. Their little friends were abandoning them to chase glory in individual dogfights. But Doolittle understood something the bomber crews could not see. The only way to protect the bombers in the long run was to destroy the German fighter force. Not just the airplanes, but the pilots. Germany could build new fighters. Replacing experienced pilots took years. The stage was set for the decisive air battle of the European War. The offensive began on February 20th, 1944. Officially, it was called Operation Argument. History would remember it by another name. Big Week. History would remember it as Big Week for 6 days. The 8th Air Force, flying from England, and the 15th Air Force, flying from bases in Italy, threw everything they had at Germany's aircraft industry. The targets were carefully chosen. Messerschmitt plants at Regensburg and Augsburg, Focke-Wulf facilities at Aschersleben and Tutow, Junkers factories at Bernburg, and ball-bearing plants that had been left untouched since Black Thursday. The scale of the operation was unprecedented. On February 20th alone, more than 1,000 bombers took off from English and Italian bases. Fighter escorts numbered in the hundreds. The Luftwaffe had never faced anything like it. General Frederick Anderson, who planned the offensive, explained the strategy with brutal clarity. The goal was to force the Germans to fight, to compel them to put every fighter they had into the air to defend those factories. Because once they were airborne, American fighters could get at them. The calculation was ruthless. The bombers were bait, flying deep into Germany to draw out the defenders. The fighters were the real weapon, tasked with destroying the German interceptors that rose to attack the bomber streams. Every bomber lost was a tragedy for its crew. But if enough German pilots were killed in exchange, the strategy would succeed. The weather during Big Week was terrible. Low cloud and icing conditions forced many bombers to abort their missions or strike secondary targets. Navigation errors led to tragic mistakes, including the accidental bombing of Dutch cities that killed hundreds of civilians. War was never clean. The combined bomber offensive was grimly costly for everyone involved. More than 3,000 bomber sorties were flown during the 6 days of Big Week. The 8th Air Force alone lost 137 heavy bombers, with another 20 so badly damaged they were scrapped. The 15th Air Force lost 90 RAF Bomber Command, attacking the same industrial targets at night, lost between 131 and 157 aircraft, depending on how the losses were counted. The losses were heavy in absolute terms, but they represented a far smaller percentage of the attacking force than Black Thursday. The American bomber force was growing faster than the Germans could shoot it down, and now the fighters were doing their work. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had into the defense. Twin-engine, Messerschmitt Bf-110s, and Me-410s, heavily armed but slow, attempted to smash the bomber formations with rockets and heavy cannon. Single-engine Bf-109s and Fw-190s escorted the heavy fighters and attacked any bomber that strayed from formation, but now they faced the Mustangs, and the balance of power in the air was about to change. The Germans had no answer for the new American tactics. Their heavy fighters, loaded with rockets and cannon, could not maneuver against the nimble Mustangs. Their single-engine interceptors, designed for short-range engagements, found themselves outranged and outnumbered. For every American fighter the Luftwaffe shot down, it lost 3 or 4 of its own. The performance advantages of the Merlin Mustang were overwhelming at the altitudes where combat took place. At 25,000 feet, the P-51B could reach 441 miles per hour. The Bf-109 struggled to reach 390. The Mustang could dive faster, climb faster, and turn tighter than anything the Germans could throw against it. And, unlike German fighters, which had to land and refuel after 45 minutes of combat, the Mustang could fight for hours and still have fuel to spare. American pilots quickly learned to exploit these advantages. They developed tactics that maximized the Mustang's strengths, while minimizing exposure to the enemy's remaining advantages. High-speed slashing attacks from above became the standard approach. Dive on the enemy, fire a quick burst, and zoom back to altitude before the Germans could respond. The Germans called it boom and zoom. Whatever the name, it was devastating. Worse for the Luftwaffe, they were losing pilots they could not replace. During Big Week, more than 100 experienced German fighter pilots were killed or captured. These were not trainees. They were veterans with dozens of missions. Men who had fought since the Battle of Britain or on the Eastern Front. Their skills, honed over years of combat, were gone. The pilots who replaced them had only a fraction of that experience. The German training pipeline was already struggling. Fuel shortages had slashed training hours drastically. New pilots arrived at frontline units with barely 160 hours of flight time, less than half of what their American counterparts received. These inexperienced men were fed into the meat grinder of the air war, and most did not survive their first few missions. By the end of February, the Luftwaffe had lost more than 30% of its fighter aircraft in Western Europe. Losses in March would be even worse. March 4, 1944, the first American escort mission to Berlin. Colonel Don Blakeslee led his 4th Fighter Group from their base at Debden, 40 miles north of London. The pilots had been flying their P-51Bs for just a week. Some had only a few hours in the new aircraft. When higher command expressed concern that the group was not ready, Blakeslee's response was characteristic. His pilots would learn to fly the Mustang. On the way to the target, approximately 30 bombers of the 13th Combat Bomb Wing set out that morning, escorted by 28 Mustangs. The target was the German capital itself, the symbolic heart of the Nazi regime. Every German fighter within range would rise to defend it. The Americans were counting on that. The weather turned bad over Germany, limiting the effectiveness of the bombing. But the fighters pressed on. For the first time, American single-engine fighters flew over a city that had long been untouchable. The German defenders were stunned. Ground controllers, tracking the American formation, expected the fighters to turn back at any moment. When the Mustangs kept coming, pushing deeper into Germany, the controllers refused to believe their own radar. 2 days later, on March 6th, the full attack came. 800 bombers, escorted by more than 900 fighters, struck Berlin in the largest daylight raid of the war. To that point, the Luftwaffe responded with everything it had. The fighting was savage. 69 American bombers were shot down, the highest single-day loss since Black Thursday. But this time there was a crucial difference. The escorts were there all the way to the target and all the way back, and the Luftwaffe paid for every bomber it destroyed. 160 German fighters were shot down on March 6th alone. The exchange rate was roughly 2-to-1 in favor of the Americans, a dramatic reversal from the dark days of October. 1943. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group shot down 3 German fighters over Berlin that day, bringing his total to 18 victories. His wingman, Lieutenant John Godfrey, claimed 2 more. Together, they had become the most feared team in the 8th Air Force, flying in close formation and covering each other's blind spots. They had developed an almost telepathic coordination that made them deadly, and they were just getting started. Back at Debden, after the mission, a reporter from the New York Times caught Captain Pierce McKennon outside the 335th Squadron dispersal and asked if they had encountered any German fighters. McKennon's reply became legendary. "Millions, boy, millions." But the real significance of the Berlin raids was not measured in bombers that got through, or fighters that were shot down. It was simpler than that. American fighters were over Berlin for 3 years. Hermann Göring had promised the German people that no enemy bomb would ever fall on the capital. When British bombers proved him wrong in 1940, he had declared that no enemy would ever fly over Berlin by day. Now, American fighters circled freely over the city, their propellers glinting in the spring sunlight, a visible, undeniable proof that the Luftwaffe could no longer defend German airspace. The psychological impact was devastating. German civilians, who had believed in the invincibility of their air force, now watched enemy aircraft overhead with impunity. German pilots, who had once been hunters, now found themselves hunted. The Luftwaffe's commander, a fighter ace from the First World War, who had led the legendary Richthofen circus after the Red Baron's death, understood air combat at a fundamental level. He also understood logistics. A fighter over Berlin was not just a symbol, it was proof. It had taken off in England, flown 600 miles across occupied Europe, fought its way through German defenses, and still had enough fuel to return home. The only way to protect the bombers was with an aircraft that had extraordinary range. The Germans had nothing comparable. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was an excellent fighter, but it was designed for short-range operations. Even with drop tanks, it could not match the Mustang's reach. The Focke-Wulf FW 190 suffered similar limitations. German pilots were fighting over their own territory, within sight of their airfields, and they were still being outranged by American escorts. General Adolphe Galland, the Luftwaffe's general of the fighter arm, later described the moment when he personally confirmed what Göring had long feared. When reports arrived that American single-engine fighters were over Berlin, the official response was disbelief. There were no long-range escort fighters, the staff insisted. Perhaps the American pilots had gotten lost, or maybe they planned to crash land in Sweden. Galland decided to see for himself. He took off in his FW 190 with another general and flew toward the reported American positions. They found the Mustangs exactly where they were not supposed to be, over Germany. The Americans found them too. According to Galland's memoir, he escaped by firing his guns and using the smoke and shell casings to convince the pursuing Mustangs that someone was shooting at them from behind. The other general was not so lucky. He was shot down after that. There were no more arguments about whether American fighters could reach Berlin. The killing continued through the spring of 1944. On April 8, the 4th Fighter Group alone claimed 33. German aircraft destroyed, the highest single mission total for any American unit in the war. The Luftwaffe lost nearly 200 fighters that day. The Germans tried to adapt. They developed new tactics, new formations, and new ways of attacking the bomber streams. They rushed improved aircraft into service, including the revolutionary Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter. None of it mattered. The fundamental problem was attrition. Every day, the Luftwaffe lost pilots. Every day, their replacements were less experienced. Every day, the Americans grew stronger as new groups arrived from the training pipeline. By May 1944, German fighter pilot training had been cut to just 112 hours, barely enough to learn basic flying skills. American pilots arrived at their units with 450 hours or more. In combat, experience was survival. The green German pilots died in droves. The numbers told the story. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe lost nearly 17% of its fighter pilots. In February, another 18%. In March, approximately 22%. In April, similar losses continued. By May, the monthly loss rate had reached 25%. An air force cannot sustain such casualties and remain effective. The Luftwaffe's fighter arm was bleeding to death. The Germans tried everything to slow the bleeding. They rushed new aircraft designs into production. They reorganized fighter units to concentrate strength at critical points. They developed heavy fighter formations, specifically designed to break through the Mustang escort screen and reach the bombers. None of it worked. The Sturmgruppen were the most dramatic response. These units flew heavily armored Focke-Wulf FW-190s. Their pilots were sworn to close to point-blank range and destroy bombers or die trying. The armor added weight and reduced performance, making these aircraft easy prey for Mustangs. Yet, the Sturmgruppen pilots pressed their attacks with fanatical determination. Some succeeded. Individual bomber groups suffered terribly when a Sturmgruppe broke through. But for every bomber destroyed, multiple German fighters were lost. The exchange rate was never in Germany's favor. The problem was not tactics, or equipment, or even courage. The problem was numbers. America was producing pilots faster than Germany could kill them. Germany was losing pilots faster than it could replace them. Every week, the disparity grew wider. Every week, the Luftwaffe grew weaker, and June was coming. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The largest amphibious invasion in history. 156,000 Allied soldiers crossed the English Channel and stormed the beaches of Normandy. They were supported by nearly 12,000 aircraft, the greatest concentration of air power ever assembled. Fighters patrolled continuously over the beaches. Bombers struck German positions inland. Air superiority won over Germany by attrition, and the Mustang was absolute. Transport aircraft dropped paratroopers behind enemy lines. The Luftwaffe's response was tragically inadequate. The most famous German attack of the day came from Oberleutnant Joseph Prell, commander of JG-26. He and his wingman, Unteroffizier Heinz Waterchick, took off from their base near Lille and flew west toward the beaches. Dodging Allied formations, they located the invasion fleet spread across the horizon and made a single strafing pass over what the British called Sword Beach. Preller's attack became legendary, later immortalized in film. But while it was the most dramatic Luftwaffe response of the morning, it was not the only one. Other German aircraft flew sorties throughout the day, including attacks by KG-54 on British positions. Yet the total German effort remained pitiful compared to the Allied armada overhead. For the entire day, the Luftwaffe managed only 319 sorties over Normandy. The Allies flew 14,674. The ratio was approximately 46-1. General Eisenhower had promised his troops before the invasion, "If you see fighting aircraft over you, they will be ours." It was not bravado, it was simple fact. The air superiority that made D-Day possible had been won in the spring of 1944, won by Mustang pilots over Berlin, Leipzig, Brunswick, and Frankfurt. Won by bomber crews who served as bait to draw the Luftwaffe into battle. Won by mechanics and armorers who kept the planes flying and the guns firing. The price had been high. Thousands of American airmen died in the skies over Germany. But they had accomplished something no air force had ever done. They had destroyed the enemy's ability to contest the sky in the weeks following D-Day. The consequences of Luftwaffe weakness became brutally apparent. German armored divisions, attempting to reach the front, were pounded from the air. Tank columns, moving by day, were attacked by swarms of Allied fighter bombers. Artillery positions that revealed themselves were immediately targeted. The supply convoys were shredded. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B in Normandy, wrote despairingly to his wife, "The enemy has complete control of the air over the battle area, and up to about 100 kilometers behind the front. Every movement of any significance during the day draws bombing and strafing." German generals tried to adapt by moving only at night, but this slowed operations catastrophically. Reinforcements that should have reached the front in hours took days. Counterattacks requiring precise timing became impossible to coordinate. The breakthrough at Saint-Lay in late July shattered the German defensive line in Normandy. Allied armored columns poured through the gap, racing across France at speeds German intelligence could not track. Paris was liberated in August. By September, Allied forces were approaching the German border. All of this was possible because the Luftwaffe could not intervene. German fighters that rose to contest the Allied advance were shot down by the ever-present Mustangs. German ground attack aircraft were hunted before they could reach their targets. German reconnaissance planes were destroyed before they could report. Allied movements, the war continued for 11 more months after D-Day. The Luftwaffe never recovered. German aircraft production actually peaked in September 1944. Turning out nearly 4,000 fighters in a single month. But there were not enough pilots to fly them, not enough fuel to train new pilots, and not enough experienced leaders to teach them how to survive. The jets arrived too late, and in too few numbers to matter. The Me-262 was faster than any Allied fighter, but it was complex and unreliable, and its pilots were often inexperienced men with no business flying the most advanced aircraft in the world. By January 1945, new German fighter pilots were arriving at frontline units with as little as 50 hours of total flight time. Many crashed on their first operational flights, never even seeing an enemy aircraft. The Mustang squadrons, meanwhile, ranged freely over Germany. They shot down German fighters wherever they found them, strafed airfields to destroy aircraft on the ground, and attacked trains, trucks, and anything else that moved. The strategic bombing campaign, so close to failure in October 1943, had finally achieved its objectives. German oil production collapsed under sustained attacks. German industry, dispersed and hidden though it was, could not keep pace with the destruction. German cities burned. When the war ended in May 1945, American pilots in Europe had claimed nearly 5,000 German aircraft destroyed in air combat. The Mustang accounted for the majority of those victories. Hermann Göring survived the war. He surrendered to American forces in May 1945 and was tried at Nuremberg for crimes against humanity. During his captivity, he was interviewed extensively about the air war. In interrogations recorded in the USFE Air Intelligence Summary of June 1945, Göring stated that when long-range fighters appeared over Berlin, he knew the eventual results would be catastrophic. He credited long-range fighters with delivering a major strategic blow to German planning and considered them collectively one of the most decisive factors in the ultimate outcome of the war. The Reichsmarschall, the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, had watched American fighters over his capital and understood that the war was unwinnable. All the promises of Nazi propaganda, all the boasts of German technological superiority, all the claims of inevitable victory collapsed in that moment. Göring was convicted of war crimes and sentenced to death, but he cheated the hangman by taking cyanide. The night before his execution, Adolf Galland, general of the fighter arm, survived the war as well. He had been relieved of command in January 1945, after repeated conflicts with Göring over the conduct of the air war. Given permission to return to combat flying, he formed a special unit of jet pilots that flew Mi-262s in the final weeks of the war. Afterward, Galland worked as a consultant to the Argentine Air Force, and later ran his own business in Germany. He became friends with many of his former enemies, including British ace Douglas Bader and American ace Robert Johnson. He died in 1996 at the age of 83, never forgetting the day he flew to see the American fighters for himself and barely escaped with his life. Colonel Don Blakeslee, who led the first Mustangs over Berlin, flew more than 500 combat missions during the war. He accumulated over 1,000 hours of combat flying time, more than any other American fighter pilot. He was grounded on October 30, 1944, against his will. General William Kepner, his superior, had lost too many experienced leaders and could not afford to lose another that same day. Colonel Hubert Zemp, commander of the legendary 56th Fighter Group, went down when his P-51's wing failed in a violent storm over Germany. Zemp survived and was captured by the Germans, but his loss shocked the entire fighter command. When Blakeslee landed from what would turn out to be his last mission, General Kepner was waiting on the flight line. "You are grounded," the general told him. "I cannot afford to lose both of you." Blakeslee remained in the Air Force after the war, serving in Korea and eventually retiring as a colonel. He died in 2008 at the age of 91, of the last surviving leaders of the air war over Germany. His pilots, the men of the 4th Fighter Group, finished the war as one of the highest-scoring American units in any theater. They claimed 583 enemy aircraft shot down in air combat. With a victory-to-loss ratio of more than 2-to-1, the group had come a long way from the Eagle Squadron volunteers, who flew Spitfires when America was still at peace. The 4th was not the only group to distinguish itself. The 56th Fighter Group, flying P-47s for most of the war, destroyed more German aircraft in air combat than any other 8th Air Force fighter group. The 354th Fighter Group, the first to receive Mustangs in England, pioneered many of the escort tactics that other groups adopted. The 357th, the 339th each had their own aces, their own traditions, their own battles won and lost. Behind the kills and mission counts were thousands of individual stories. Young men from every state in America, most barely out of their teens, learned to fly high-performance aircraft and went to war against the most experienced fighter force in the world. Some became famous. Captain Clarence Anderson of the 357th Fighter Group shot down 16¼ German aircraft and survived 2 complete combat tours without ever being hit. Major George Preddy of the 352nd Fighter Group became one of the highest-scoring Mustang aces before being killed by friendly fire on Christmas Day, 1944. Captain John Godfrey, Don Gentile's wingman, compiled 18 victories before being shot down and captured in August 1944. Most were not famous. They did their jobs, flew their missions, and, if they were lucky, went home when their tours were complete. The ones who died were mourned by their squadron mates and replaced by fresh faces from the training pipeline. 4 does not wait for grief. The ground crews deserved as much credit as the pilots. These men worked in all weather, often through the night, to keep the fighters flying. They patched bullet holes, replaced worn parts, loaded ammunition, and refueled aircraft in conditions ranging from freezing mud to summer heat. A Mustang without a ground crew was useless, and the pilots knew it. They were grateful for every mechanic, armorer, and technician who kept them in the fight. The relationship between a pilot and his crew chief was often the closest bond on the base. The crew chief lived with the airplane, knew every quirk and rattle, and could diagnose problems by the sound of the engine. When a pilot failed to return, The crew chief felt the loss as personally as any squadron mate. And when a pilot came back with his aircraft riddled with holes, the crew chief would work through the night to have it ready for the next mission. The early P-51Bs had their share of mechanical problems. The guns, mounted at an angle to fit inside the thin wing, tended to jam under high G loads. Engine temperatures ran hot during ground operations. The canopy design created blind spots that German fighters could exploit. Ground crews and pilots worked together to solve these problems, developing field modifications that eventually made their way back to the factory. The later P-51D, with its bubble canopy and improved gun installation, was partly the product of combat experience fed back through these channels. The P-51 Mustang continued flying long after the war ended. It served in Korea, conducting ground attack missions in the opening months of the conflict. It served with air forces around the world, remaining operational in some countries until the 1980s. More than 15,000 Mustangs were built during the war, with some sources counting as many as 15,500, including licensed variants. The P-51D model alone accounted for over 8,000 aircraft, more than half of total production. Thousands survive today, many still flying at air shows and commemorative events. The distinctive growl of the Merlin engine has become one of the most recognizable sounds in aviation. But the Mustang's true legacy is not the aircraft that survive. It is the victory it made possible. Before the Mustang, the Allied strategic bombing campaign was failing. American bombers could not survive deep penetration raids without fighter escort, and no fighter had the range to accompany them. The arrival of the long-range Mustang changed all that, giving the Allies the air superiority they needed to turn the tide of the war. The doctrine of self-defending bomber formations had been proven wrong, at terrible cost. The Mustang changed everything. It gave the bombers the protection they needed. More importantly, it gave the Americans a weapon capable of destroying the Luftwaffe fighter force, not just in the air, but on the ground and in the training schools where new pilots were supposed to be produced. The air superiority, won by the Mustang and its pilots, made D-Day possible. It made the advance across France possible. It made the crossing of the Rhine possible. Every major Allied ground operation from June 1944 onward depended on control of the sky. Control of the sky belonged to the P-51. When Hermann Göring saw those American fighters over Berlin, he understood what was coming: the invasion, the collapse, the defeat, the destruction of everything the Nazi regime had built. It was all there in that moment, visible to anyone who knew how to read the signs. The Mustangs over Berlin meant that Germany would lose the war. Ronald Harker, the Rolls-Royce test pilot, who first suggested putting a Merlin engine in the Mustang, never became famous. His contribution to the war effort was technical, invisible to most people, but incalculably important. He lived until 1999, dying at the age of 90. His obituaries in the Times and the Daily Telegraph mentioned his work on the Merlin Mustang, but most people had never heard his name. That is often how the most important innovations happen, not through dramatic breakthroughs announced to cheering crowds, but through quiet conversations between engineers and pilots. Someone notices a problem. Someone suggests a solution. Someone has the authority to make it happen. Harker noticed that the Mustang was fast but underpowered at altitude. He suggested the Merlin. Rolls-Royce management gave him the authority to try it. And from that simple sequence, one of the most important aircraft of the 20th century was born. The bomber crews who survived because Mustangs escorted them home probably never knew Harker's name. The ground soldiers who landed at Normandy under friendly skies certainly did not. But all of them owed their lives, in part, to a test pilot who flew a disappointing American fighter for 30 minutes in April 1942, and came down with an idea. That is how wars are won, not just by the soldiers and pilots who do the fighting, but by the engineers, designers, and technicians who give them the tools they need. The Mustang was the right airplane in the right place. At the right time, but it only became that airplane because someone saw its potential and found a way to unlock it. Wars are won by people who see possibilities where others see only problems. Ronald Harker saw a great airplane trapped inside a mediocre one, and he had the vision and persistence to set it free. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. We would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.